What most Americans don't realize is that this crisis didn't begin with a demand for natural gas. It began with the assumption that dependency could be hidden indefinitely behind rhetoric about strength and sovereignty. And when that assumption collided with reality, the response wasn't just diplomatic pushback, it was a quiet but devastating redrawing of North America's energy map that will reshape power dynamics for decades to come. Here's what officially happened, stripped of the noise. The Trump administration, facing domestic energy shortages and mounting pressure from industrial states, publicly demanded expedited access to Canadian natural gas reserves. The language was familiar, framed as partnership, mutual benefit, and energy security for the continent. But beneath that surface, the demand carried an unmistakable tone of entitlement. It assumed Canada would comply not because the terms were attractive, but because saying no to the United States was unthinkable. Mark Carney's response was 4 words. Not for sale, Donald. No elaboration, no diplomatic cushioning, no room for negotiation. Just a plain statement of sovereignty that went viral within hours and triggered an $850 billion reorientation of Canadian energy exports toward Europe and Asia. If you only saw the headlines, you might have dismissed this as another round of political theater. But if you understand how energy markets actually function and how alliances are built or broken, you recognize this as a turning point that reveals far more about American power than any speech ever could. Let me walk you through why this matters and why the institutional consequences are only beginning to unfold. For years, the public story around North American energy was one of seamless integration. Pipelines crossed borders, natural gas flowed north and south based on demand, and political leaders on both sides talked about energy security as a shared project. That narrative wasn't entirely false, but it obscured a deeper reality. The relationship was never equal. The United States consumed far more than it produced in certain regions, especially in the Northeast and parts of the Midwest, while Canada sat on some of the largest natural gas reserves on the continent. That imbalance created leverage, but leverage only works when both sides acknowledge it. For decades, Canada managed that leverage quietly, maintaining cooperative frameworks and avoiding public confrontation. American policymakers, in turn, treated Canadian energy as an extension of domestic supply, something reliable and essentially guaranteed. When planning decisions were made, when industrial investments were approved, when residential heating projections were calculated, Canadian gas was baked into the assumptions, not as a foreign dependency that required careful diplomacy, but as infrastructure you simply turned on when needed. This is where the institutional reality starts to diverge from the public narrative. Dependency is not inherently problematic in international relations. Every modern economy depends on external partners for critical inputs. What becomes problematic is when dependency is denied, when it's treated as weakness rather than structure, and when the dependent party begins to believe its own rhetoric about self-sufficiency. That's what happened here. Political leaders spent years telling the American public that energy independence was achieved or imminent, that fracking and domestic production had eliminated vulnerability, that foreign suppliers no longer held meaningful cards. But energy markets don't operate on rhetoric. They operate on physical infrastructure, geological reality, and economic incentives. The United States may have increased production, but that production is concentrated in specific basins, primarily Texas, Pennsylvania, and North Dakota. Moving that gas to northeastern population centers or Midwestern industrial hubs requires pipeline capacity that doesn't exist at sufficient scale. Environmental reviews slow construction, state-level opposition blocks projects, and even when infrastructure gets built, it takes years and carries costs that make Canadian imports more attractive in many markets. What I'm describing here is not a policy failure in the traditional sense. It's a gap between political messaging and physical reality. Leaders promised energy independence because it polls well, because it sounds strong, because it lets them claim victory over foreign influence. But the engineers, the utility planners, the industrial buyers, they all knew the truth. They knew that certain regions would remain dependent on Canadian gas for the foreseeable future, that alternatives were either unavailable or prohibitively expensive, and that antagonizing the supplier was strategically incoherent. That story was never quite true. Yes, the United States increased oil and gas production dramatically over the past 2 decades. Yes, exports grew, but production and consumption don't align neatly across geography. The regions that needed gas most were not always the regions producing it. And moving energy across a continent is expensive, logistically complex, and often politically contentious. Pipelines face regulatory delays, environmental opposition, and infrastructure bottlenecks. Meanwhile, Canadian gas could flow south with relative ease through established networks that had been built over generations. So when Trump issued his demand, it wasn't really a demand between equals negotiating terms. It was a dependent actor trying to assert dominance over a supplier who had quietly grown tired of being taken for granted. And that's why Carney's response hit so hard. Not for sale, Donald. Those 4 words did something that hours of diplomatic cables and technical briefings never could. They forced into public view a dependency that American leadership had spent years pretending didn't exist. Now let's talk about what happened next, because this is where the strategic consequences start to compound. Within days of that exchange, Canadian energy officials were in Brussels, Berlin, and Asian capitals discussing long-term export agreements. These weren't symbolic gestures or leverage plays designed to bring Washington back to the table. They were structural shifts, the kind that involve massive infrastructure investments, regulatory alignment, and decades-long contracts. Europe, facing its own energy insecurity after years of over-reliance on Russian gas, was eager for stable alternatives. Asian markets, particularly Japan and South Korea, were equally interested in diversifying their LNG sources. Canada had something both continents wanted: abundant reserves, political stability, regulatory predictability, and a government willing to sign contracts that wouldn't evaporate with the next election cycle. What Canada also had, and this is critical, was leverage that American policymakers had failed to recognize because they were too busy performing strength to notice the quiet accumulation of alternatives. Every pipeline to a coastal LNG terminal, every trade agreement with European partners, every energy security dialogue with Asian buyers, all of it represented optionality. And optionality is power. The $850 billion figure that's been circulating represents the estimated value of Canadian energy exports that will now flow to non-American markets over the next decade. Some of that shift was already in motion before this confrontation, but Carney's response accelerated it dramatically. It sent a signal to global energy markets that Canada was no longer treating the United States as its default customer. And once that signal is sent, once infrastructure begins moving in a different direction, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Think about what this means in practical terms. LNG terminals on Canada's west coast are being expanded to serve Asian markets. Pipelines to Atlantic ports are being fast-tracked to reach European buyers. Investment capital that might have flowed into cross-border infrastructure is now being redirected toward export facilities that bypass the United States entirely. Each of these projects represents a 10 to 20-year commitment. They're not temporary pivots that can be undone with a phone call or a policy shift. They're structural reorientations that will define energy flows for a generation. And here's what makes this particularly consequential. Europe's energy crisis, triggered by over-reliance on Russian gas, created urgent demand for alternatives. German industry, French utilities, Polish energy security planners, they're all desperate for stable, predictable suppliers. Canada offers exactly that. A democratic partner, abundant reserves, existing LNG infrastructure, and a government that honors contracts. The premium they're willing to pay for that reliability is substantial. And that premium is coming directly out of what would have been American access under more stable diplomatic conditions. Asia tells a similar story. Japan and South Korea have been seeking to diversify LNG supplies for years, worried about concentration risk and geopolitical instability in traditional supplier regions. Canadian gas, delivered through Pacific terminals, reduces their exposure to Middle Eastern volatility and Chinese influence over regional energy markets. It's not just about price. It's about strategic autonomy. And when countries pay for strategic autonomy, they lock in those relationships with long-term contracts that are very difficult to displace. Here's what I find most revealing about this entire episode. The demand itself was tactically incoherent. You don't secure energy partnerships by issuing ultimatums to suppliers who have other options. You secure them by being a reliable customer, by honoring agreements, by treating partners with respect, and by acknowledging mutual dependence rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Every single one of those principles was violated in the approach taken here. The assumption seemed to be that Canada had no choice, that geography and historical ties would override any short-term friction, and that American market size alone guaranteed compliance. That assumption was wrong. And the reason it was wrong tells us something important about how power actually works in the 21st century. Size still matters, but reliability matters more. Predictability matters. The ability to plan long term without worrying that political winds will shred your contracts matters enormously. Canada has been offering that to global partners, while the United States has been offering volatility, sudden policy reversals, and leadership that treats international agreements as disposable. Which one do you think attracts investment? Let's also talk about what this means for American workers and consumers, because the damage here isn't abstract. When energy supplies tighten, prices rise. When prices rise, households feel it immediately in heating bills, electricity costs, and the price of goods that require energy-intensive production. Industrial users feel it in operating expenses that squeeze margins and delay hiring. Manufacturers feel it in input costs that make them less competitive globally. None of this is hypothetical, it's mechanical. Reduce supply or increase geopolitical risk around supply, and markets reprice instantly. What makes this especially frustrating from a policy perspective is that it was avoidable. Energy security is a real challenge. Climate transition complicates it further, but the solution to that challenge is not performative dominance over allies. It's investment in infrastructure, diversification of sources, and diplomatic frameworks that make cooperation attractive rather than coerced. The approach taken here achieved the opposite. It made a stable supplier less stable, turned a cooperative relationship adversarial, and handed leverage to competitors who were already looking for ways to reduce American influence in global energy markets. And here's where the institutional damage becomes clearer. Alliances are built on trust, and trust is built through consistency. When partners see that agreements can be ignored, that respect is optional, and that dependency will be exploited rather than managed mutually, they adjust. They don't announce it with press releases. They quietly begin hedging. They build alternative relationships. They invest in infrastructure that reduces exposure. They sign contracts with other buyers and sellers. And over time, those adjustments accumulate into a strategic realignment that is very difficult to reverse. Europe has learned this lesson painfully over the past few years. Over-reliance on any single supplier, no matter how convenient or cheap, creates vulnerability that will eventually be exploited. So European governments are now willing to pay a premium for diversification. They'll sign longer contracts, invest in LNG terminals, and absorb higher costs in exchange for supply security. Canada fits perfectly into that strategy, geographically distant but politically stable, resource-rich but regulation-heavy in ways that reassure European partners about environmental and governance standards. It's exactly the kind of partnership that builds resilience. From Canada's perspective, this shift also reflects a broader recalibration that's been underway for years. The assumption that prosperity depends on American goodwill is eroding, not because of hostility, but because of volatility. When your largest trading partner swings between cooperation and confrontation based on electoral cycles and personal grievances, planning becomes impossible. And when planning becomes impossible, you look for alternatives. That's not betrayal, that's survival. What I find particularly striking is how little self-awareness seems to exist on the American side about how this behavior is perceived. There's a tendency to interpret any pushback from allies as ingratitude or disloyalty, as if partnership means subordination. But that's not how modern alliances work. They work through mutual benefit, shared risk, and recognition that dependency flows both ways. When one side refuses to acknowledge that, when it treats cooperation as a favor rather than a transaction, the relationship unravels. And it unravels quietly, through 1,000 small decisions that add up to a strategic divorce. The natural gas confrontation is a perfect example. On the surface, it looks like one leader insulting another and getting a sharp response. But underneath, it's a structural shift that reflects years of accumulated frustration, eroded trust, and growing recognition that the United States is no longer the stable anchor it once was. Canada isn't punishing America, it's protecting itself. And in a system where economic actors prioritize stability and long-term planning, protection often means diversification. Now let's talk about what this means going forward, because the trajectory here is not encouraging for American influence. Energy markets are sticky. Once contracts are signed, once infrastructure is built, once supply chains are established, they don't shift back easily just because political leadership changes. Even if a future administration wanted to repair the relationship, even if it offered better terms, the global energy landscape will have moved on. European LNG terminals will be receiving Canadian gas. Asian buyers will have locked in long-term agreements, and Canadian producers will have diversified their customer base in ways that reduce dependence on any single market. That's not speculation. That's how markets respond to instability. They build redundancy, they reduce concentration risk, they pay for optionality. And once that optionality exists, once suppliers and buyers have alternatives, the leverage that comes from being the dominant player dissipates. You're still important, but you're no longer indispensable. And in international relations, indispensability is the foundation of influence. There's also a domestic political dimension here that deserves attention. When energy prices rise, when shortages appear, when industrial users struggle with costs, the political consequences land on whoever is in power at the time. It doesn't matter whether the problem was created by decisions made years earlier. Voters see prices, they see disruptions, and they demand accountability. That creates a vicious cycle where leadership is incentivized to focus on short-term fixes, performative toughness, and blame shifting rather than long-term strategy. The natural gas crisis fits perfectly into that cycle. Rather than acknowledging dependency and negotiating respectfully, leadership issued a demand that assumed compliance. When compliance didn't come, the response wasn't reflection or adjustment. It was escalation, accusations, and doubling down. That might generate applause from certain audiences in the moment, but it doesn't secure energy supplies. It doesn't lower prices. It doesn't rebuild trust. It just accelerates the shift toward a world where American preferences matter less and less in decisions that directly affect American prosperity. What concerns me most, and I want to be very clear about this, is not that Canada defended its sovereignty. That's rational and expected. What concerns me is that American leadership seems genuinely surprised by that defense, as if the idea that allies might say no was incomprehensible. That level of disconnect from reality is dangerous. It suggests a political class that has lost touch with how power actually operates, that confuses performance with effectiveness, and that mistakes volume for influence. History is full of examples of dominant powers that overreached, assumed too much, and discovered too late that the world had moved on. The transitions aren't always dramatic. They happen through incremental shifts, through partners quietly building alternatives, through competitors filling vacuums that nobody announced were opening. By the time the decline becomes undeniable, the infrastructure of influence has already eroded. Reversing it requires not just policy changes, but credibility that can take generations to rebuild. The natural gas confrontation won't be remembered as the moment American power collapsed, but it might be remembered as one of many moments where that power was carelessly squandered, where allies were alienated over issues that could have been managed cooperatively, and where short-term political theater took precedence over long-term strategic thinking. And those moments accumulate. They shape how other countries plan, how they invest, and who they trust when making decisions that will define their futures. So when you see that forward response, not for sale, Donald, understand what it represents. It's not just a refusal, it's a boundary, it's a statement that sovereignty is not negotiable, that dependency does not mean subordination, and that partnership requires respect. Those are principles that used to define American diplomacy. The fact that they now define resistance to American demands tells you everything you need to know about how far the institutional foundation has eroded. The $850 billion export shift is already in motion. Contracts are being signed, infrastructure is being built, and the assumption that Canada will always prioritize the American market, that assumption is dead. What replaces it will depend on choices made in the coming years, on whether leadership recognizes the costs of this approach or doubles down, on whether alliances are treated as assets to be nurtured or leveraged to be exploited. Right now, the trajectory is clear. And it's not pointing toward renewed American influence. It's pointing toward a world where influence is more distributed, where options are more abundant, and where the ability to say no carries more weight than the ability to demand compliance. That's the world emerging from this confrontation. Not because of malice, not because of ideology, but because institutions matter, credibility matters, and respect matters. When those things are treated as optional, when they're sacrificed for short-term political gain, the long-term costs are paid by everyone, workers, consumers, communities, and ultimately the national interest itself. Understanding that doesn't require partisan loyalty. It just requires paying attention to how systems actually work and being honest about the gap between the story we tell ourselves and the reality unfolding in front of us.